Hey, Vassals! Welcome to Vassals of Kingsgrave's epic Agatha Christie reread. My name is Bina007. I'm going to be your host today. Unfortunately, the Lord Baron Xander is down for the count this week. We wish him well and hope to welcome him back soon. But I am joined by my trusty comrade in arms, Hannah.
Hey, it's Shadow on Discord.
And we have rallied. We are here for episode 21 of the reread, 1936's Cards on the Table. Yet another book published in 1936. Agatha Christie is 46. She is in her prime. She is earning a bunch of money. She is the master of her craft. Maybe cynical about her craft. We'll get into that when we discuss the character Ariadne Oliver. I don't know. Is this a good book? It feels to me like it's often not considered in the classics with things like Murder on the Orient Express, but it's a personal favorite of mine. I give it all the lemon cakes. Hannah, this is the first time you've explored this book. What did you think?
Yeah, I immensely enjoyed it. And
Yay!
There were some frustrating parts where she's a little repetitive, but in general, I thought it was very self-aware and meta in a delightful way. And especially when you think like modern sensibilities, oh, that's nothing new. But for her and her time, I just thought it's very, if you like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia at all, for that, like this is that version of that.
Yeah.
Where she's nodding to herself and poking fun at herself while weaving together a pretty intricate mystery. Since I was coming in cold, I tried like hell to solve it. Every time any detail was given, I wrote it down, and I had a big notebook going. I was doing armchair detecting. I got pretty close to the solution, but I didn't get the exact solution.
It is twisty and turning. And I love that. I love seeing your notes. Listener Hannah sent me photos of her notebook, and it's amazing detection. I'm so in awe because I'm so bad at detection. But yeah, you got
it would have helped if I knew how to play bridge.
Yes.
I think that would have helped a lot.
Yes, the cards on the table of the title listener refer to the game of bridge, which I'll get into how popular that was at the time. Nonetheless, I don't play bridge either, or I haven't played it since university. So I think you can enjoy it without it, but it probably
Lord Byron's got his homework cut out for him, because I'm going to tell him, like, first learn how to play bridge, then read this one. and then if you can solve it.
It is great Hercule Poirot. So he's going to love the bit where Poirot is like, but if what you say is right, I'm wrong, and I'm never wrong. What is happening?
As an HP fan, he's going to go gaga over this one, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I think so. Why I love this book. Number one, it's peak Poirot. I love Poirot. I love Ariadne Oliver. But I think most of why people who love this book is that, we're 15 years into her writing career now. And she, like you say, it's so meta. It's so clever because she's telling us what she thinks about detective fiction. She's telling us what she thinks about becoming famous and rich and the joys of serialization and earning money from her books. I think there's so much about how she feels about her craft that becomes like a glimpse behind the curtain. I've been reading this really good book all the way through this series called Agatha Christie, The Woman and Her Mysteries by Gillian Gill, which is out of print, so you have to get it from a secondhand bookstore. And this is what she says, quote, Agatha was well aware that her books ranked with the great detective works of the past, and she was enjoying her own preeminence. She steadfastly refused offers to write any sustained commentary on the detective genre. However, her mature novels are full of remarks about the craft of detective writing. In Chapter 3 of the ABC Murders, she sets up a perfect locked room mystery. As Poirot says, a very simple crime, very intimate. He imagines 4 people sitting down to play bridge while the 5th sits nearby close to the fire. At some point in the game, the player, who is dummy, gets up and murders the man in the chair. Intent upon the game, the other 3 players notice nothing amiss. The resulting novel is one of Christie's favourites, and it is a detective novelist's detective novel. In this book, Christie sets out technical rules for a narrative game of such difficulty that only the brilliant writer herself can come out a winner. There is a foreword, which is unusual, She doesn't want to be associated with the least likely suspect did at school because she always wants her murderers to have a psychological motive. And I think it's really interesting that she mentions Sherlock Holmes and the curious incident of the dog in the night. But that's why I love this book, because I think it's kind of like Christie is so confident. I mean, she is like badass girl boss at this moment, right? She just knows that she's up there with Sherlock Holmes. She knows her creation of Poirot is popular and she knows her craft, and she's just gonna play with us and say, look, I'm gonna make this so easy for you. There are 4 detectives, there are 4 criminals and 1 victim. One of the 4 criminals is going to have done it. There are no tricks in this book. It's not everyone did it or no one did it. Someone did do it. There's only 4 to pick from. Off you go and see if you can outwit me.
I believe it's this book, and they might have made mention of it in ABC as well. But I'm pretty sure at one point Poirot says, very few of the crimes that Jack the Ripper committed were committed by Jack the Ripper. And I also took that as being aware that her characters, so she herself is up there with other famous detective fiction writers, but her characters are considered in the echelon of real life famous crimes as well. And, that might come off as pompous in another circumstance, but given that she's a female writer in her time, I think it's a very sincere way to show pride at your accomplishments.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's really beautifully done.
Because she doesn't out and say it either. It's just it's implicit, and I appreciated that like stroke of the pen there.
Yeah, I agree. She's a class act. She really is. Maybe a word on Bridge. So Bridge is not a game. I wonder if our listener has even heard of it. I think, for older people, maybe you will have heard of Bridge, but poker now seems to be the sort of the card game of choice. But apparently,
I always wanted to learn.
Yeah. Well, when you come over, I will teach you. Bridge.
Well, I think I'm gonna try to learn now because I'm so intrigued, and it sounds like a game I'd want to play because there's skill and chance involved.
Yeah, exactly. The restriction on Bridge, though, unlike poker, is you do need 4 people to play. Like you can't just have 3 or 5 or 7. It's quite strict on that. But apparently, it would have been immensely, immensely popular at the time, and pretty much all of her readers would have known how to play it. Apparently, and not just in Britain, apparently, according to Wikipedia, so health warning, in 1944, 40% of US households played Bridge. That kind of blew my mind. So maybe this is what people did after dinner before TV. And apparently it's very common, like if you read plays and books of the period, that you would host a dinner party, then after dinner you would break up into groups of 4 people and play Bridge. And if you think back to things like Jane Austen novels, often after dinner, the party's splitting up. But it's very important they're in groups of 4 because basically the 4 detectives play Bridge in one room. The 4 people who are maybe killers play Bridge in another room. And Shaytana, the victim, is kind of in between. And that is the kind of the closed room mechanism by which this murder can happen. And the other absolutely crucial thing about Bridge is that each player keeps score. And you can keep score with different scoring methods. But from these Bridge scores, Poirot thinks he can intuit the psychology of everyone who was there. So he detects in 2 methods. He says, there's no big clue. There's no big kind of like, gun hidden under the table, but he's going to ask each player what they remember of the room to see kind of how they remember things and what they notice and what's important to them, but also to look at the Bridge scores. And Agatha Christie actually prints, so you can see the Bridge scores kind of in the handwriting in the book. And we know that when Agatha Christie gives us a letter or a map,
no, I wish I had a hard copy.
Yeah, so if you're audiobook, you won't see this, but it's always important when she actually puts a kind of facsimile picture of something in a book, because it means this is a really vital clue, which it turns out to be. So yeah, Bridge, I don't know. I played it a bit in university, actually. They had a university Bridge club, but it kind of feels like I don't really know anyone who plays Bridge now. Maybe some of the sort of grandpa generation still do, but it feels like it's kind of gone. But if anyone out there plays Bridge, let us know, because we would like to learn and refresh and maybe get into it.
I'm definitely ready. So, interesting fact about this book.
Mm.
It was published on my birthday.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
That is
Obviously not
very
my birth year,
well.
which I won't say
I
what it
have a
is.
very, very cool facsimile hard copy, and I'm now going to post it to you because I feel you should own the book for your birthday. That's such a cool Agatha
Aw.
Christie like little. Yeah, lovely.
Um,
Okay, well,
and
let's
I was thinking she must have already been writing this when ABC came out.
or at least have had the idea because Poirot basically describes the setup in ABC.
Yeah, because January to November, I mean, that's not a long time. And this one is fairly lengthy.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting when you read, she's got these very famous notebooks that she kept where she scribbled down ideas and plots and characters, very similar to the notebooks that you photographed and sent me, Hannah. Very similar in like, ideas all over the place and arrows and lines and boxes of characters. And she would often have loads and loads of ideas floating about at the same time that she was working on simultaneously. A bit like Ariadne Oliver says, like, I have so many ideas. The idea is not the problem. The problem is like wrestling it down into a book. But if you think about it, in 1935, she published three-act tragedy in Death in the Clouds. In 36, ABC Murders, Murder in Mesopotamia, and Cards on the Table. 37, Dumb Witness, Death on the Nile. 30. So, I mean, this was 1934. She did Orient Express, Unfinished Portrait, and Why Didn't I Ask Evans? I mean, she's doing 2 or 3 books a year. So she
Yeah,
clearly has to have all the ideas on the go at the same time, right?
it's very much 9 to 5,
Yeah.
which is
In,
fantastic. She's not
although
resting
in a
on what.
way, yeah, I'm just saying. Actually, this was published in the US in 37, but yeah, in the UK it was published in 36. So this was a 3-book year, and 3, Murder in Mesopotamia was not good, which is why we did not do a full podcast on it. But this definitely is. Okay, listeners, so we're going to carry on talking without spoilers. Then there's going to be the end credit music, and then we will get into the solution. So you're safe to listen for this bit. Shall we get into the characters, Hannah? So we have our 4 detectives, our Hercule Poirot, private detective, Superintendent Battle, who's a Scotland Yard policeman. We've got Colonel Race, who's a sort of shadowy, maybe a spy working for British intelligence. And we have Ariadne Oliver, who is an Agatha Christie style detective writer. How did you find Poirot in this book? This is where we miss Sander, right? The Poirotness of Poirot.
No, I thought he was actually fairly tame in this one compared to some of the others, as his self-importance and you know, proclamation. And I think it's because, he doesn't have Hastings with him in this
To
book. He
patronize.
doesn't have,
Yeah.
yeah, he doesn't have sort of anyone to abuse. He's got Battle, who's very competent. I would argue. What I got out of it is he actually respects Battle more than Jap in a lot of
Oh
ways.
yeah, Superintendent Battle, definitely. I think Agatha Christie goes to great pains to show us A, just how good Battle is, and B, how much Poirot respects him. And I think this softens Poirot for me. Because I think in the other books, you often see him, he really does take the piss out of Hastings. And, he likes Jap, but I don't think he thinks of Jap as an equal. Whereas actually, I think Poirot emerges here as softer because he genuinely does get on with Battle and respect him. And I think
Right.
probably Colonel Race too. We don't see much of Race. So I think it's a kind
Yeah,
of
race doesn't really come under his scrutiny that much, but he's also not that present. I do, and I think that he has a certain amount of respect for Ariadne Oliver as well. Like
oh
he's,
yeah, yeah.
and I don't
Especially as
believe
their
that it's
relationship goes on.
placating. Like, oh, haha, that's so cute. You're a detective writer. No, what you're
Yeah.
talking about. He actually treats her with a lot of grace. And appreciates what she has to contribute. So it does really soften him a bit. I mean, he still has his Poirot-ness and his edge. It's just not to the extent that it normally is.
Yeah, I think that I was trying to find some good Poirot quotes to whet Xander's appetite. One of them was, "I have a bourgeois attitude to murder. I disapprove of it."
But then she takes issue with him saying that. Like, that was a very strange moment for me personally.
I know. And then the second quote, which I think really is a bit more Poirot and a bit more arrogant, he says, "It is not my business, no, but all the same, it offends my amour propre, so my my honor, my sense of myself. I consider it an impertinence, you comprehend, for a murder to be committed under my very nose by someone who mocks himself at my ability to solve it." So it's almost like he's going to solve the murder, not because of feeling a duty of justice to the victim, but because he's pissed off that someone would murder someone in the room next to him and not think he could solve it. So
Yeah.
That's peak Poirot.
He has one towards the beginning too, on his first meeting with Shaytana, where he's talking about how ridiculous Shaytana looks with his mustache.
I know. Oh, and you're like, Poirot, but we learnt in ABC Murders that you dye your moustache. What are you doing? Then we have Superintendent Battle, and we've already said that, this is a really interesting character. We actually met him in The Secret at Chimneys, a very early kind of action-adventure novel, which a lot of people think is rubbish. And he's kind of like quite a very mysterious and impressive but minor character in that. He's now older, he's more senior, as is Poirot. I mean, Poirot, when we meet him at the first, is just a sort of retired refugee of no standing. But by now, he's very rich, he's very well travelled. He's at home in a drawing room of Mr. Shaytana. But yeah, Superintendent Battle. There's a really interesting exchange where Rhoda Dawes, one of the characters, says, "What is Superintendent Battle like?" asked Rhoda curiously. Major Despard said gravely, "He's an extraordinarily astute man, a man of remarkable ability." "Oh," said Rhoda, and said he looked rather stupid. A further quotation, which I think tells you a lot about both Despard, that he's a good judge of character, but also Anne, that she isn't. And there's another quote, my final quote on Battle, from Poirot. "The good square Superintendent Battle. He may look wooden, but he is not wooden in the head, not at all." "I agree," said Despard. "That stolidity is a pose. He is a very clever and able officer." And I think Agatha Christie is trying to tell us, that Poirot is able to respect people, but also I think she's also telling us something about Despard, because he's obviously one of the suspects. But I think we're meant to think that because he rates Battle, who Poirot also rates, maybe that reflects well on him. How did you find Battle as a character?
I really enjoyed him. I like Jap also, but obviously to be more competent. So I enjoyed the dynamic with him and Poirot, especially of sort of having an equal for seems like the first time, at least in a long time. Even when he's with his friend from the company Vagan Lee in Orient Express, he's still condescending to his friend, and making comments. "Oh, you don't get it. You don't see what I see." And he never does that with Battle. He really is taking in his information in equal measure. He's never like, "Oh, how could he be so stupid to not understand?" He, like, when Battle's like, "What's your game with the bridge scores?" He just explains it.
It's really, really fascinating seeing Poirot in this kind of relationship. It's interesting, actually, because this book is written in the third person, so we're not constrained by having it be someone's diaries or Captain Hastings' memoirs. And so Agatha Christie can just take us off with Battle for us to observe how he gathers information when he goes to the West Coast. And there's a really lovely passage where she kind of describes him just going around the village, talking to different people. Some might have thought he was like buying a house. Some might have thought he was, a workman. Like, he doesn't really give away his identity, but somehow manages to get the information out. And I just thought it was like a really good description of a policeman basically just trying to figure out what's going on with the case. And we've never really had that before.
I love he's not locking Poirot out, but he's not relying on either. He is literally doing his job with all the resources that he has possible. Like, the way he questions Dr. Roberts' secretary is very critical. Like, the way that he has the tail put on Despas, the way that he sends the cute kid up to that one village to get information, because he knows, the dashing young, Constable Oliver, he'll get more out of the washerwomen than Battle will, you
Yeah,
know.
exactly. It's
And
so
he's
clever.
gonna be
And
really good, and he's great at his job, and it's nice. It's a nice reminder that in this little world she's built, she's aware that it can't all be on Poirot like he's some superhuman. There has to be underlying solid police work within
yeah,
Scotland Yard.
especially if you want to get a conviction at some point on someone.
Yeah, and Ben seems like a genuinely good man. Like, he
Yeah.
seems respectful to women. He seems respectful to his colleagues, respectful to the public's privacy. You know, he just seems like a good man and a good cop. And I do hope we see him again. I enjoyed him a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, Secret at Chimneys is a slightly weird book. It's more in her sort of kind of semi trying to be PG Woodhouse era in the 20s. But if you do like Battle, it's worth checking that one out because he is in that. He is the cop. I mean, there isn't a Poirot in that one, and he's pretty good in that too.
Okay, great.
Okay, so over to Colonel Race, who we will meet again, but does not really feature much in this. I mean, Colonel Race is this very dashing. There was a period of Agatha Christie in her early 20s where she clearly had a type, and that type was a sort of sun-kissed, muscular, real man's man, colonial adventurer who was off in Africa. And she kind of married a guy, her first husband, who was a little bit in that mold, and then he kind of let her down. But she does occasionally bring back these types. And I think Major Despard and Colonel Race are kind of the same character in a way. These kind of men's men who daring do, run around the empire, sort of visiting Kabul and putting down a sort of an uprising there, or going off into the Brazilian jungle. But Colonel Race doesn't. I found it. He's one of my favorite characters in Death on the Nile, but I just didn't really have a feeling for him in this book. And basically, all he does, I mean, all the 4 detectives are assigned after the murder to go and follow up on particular suspects, and he just basically does a few international background checks on Major Despard and says, "I've got to fuck off now to Afghanistan because I've got to go and do some secret work." And then he just goes halfway through the novel. And it's like, what? He just went? Okay.
Yeah, he does like the Irish goodbye in the office there.
Yeah. But how did you find him? Because this is presumably, well, no, you've done Death on the Nile, but how did you find him here?
I honestly didn't recognize that he's from Death on the Nile until you
But why
said it,
would
right?
you? He's in for about 5 minutes in this
Yeah.
book.
Now that you said it, I'm like, oh, that's right. I would say underutilized, except for the fact that between Battle, Poirot, and Oliver in this, like, it's very well rounded. So I don't miss him. Like, I don't need it. It's cheeky how he pops in with the info, but I didn't take his info too much into account because he just sort of like lays it down on the table and is like, I think that this is the truth.
Yeah.
And everyone's like, okay, good enough. So I didn't really like credit it that much.
I mean, there's no reason why Battle couldn't have just like telegrammed someone in Brazilian police and got the info anyway. Yeah, my
Yeah.
secret theory, well, not secret theory, my theory is that he's actually too similar to Major Despard. And so Agatha Christie struggled to make him like a separate character. So she just wrote him out. I think it's like really cheeky. I think she was like, I need 4 detectives because I need, that's the symmetry. And then she's
Right.
halfway through writing the book, she's like, oh yeah, I've just got really nothing to give him. And she likes to work with detectives in a 3, like Hastings, Japp and Poirot, or here Battle, Poirot and Ariadne Oliver. I just feel it was maybe overkill. And she was just like, fuck it, I'm just going to write him out.
Yeah.
Pretty hilarious. Okay, so enough with Colonel Race until we get to Death on the Nile. And then last, but definitely not least, Ariadne Oliver, who will be a repeat character like Colonel Race. She is a pastiche, basically, of Agatha Christie. She is also middle-aged, also slightly chubby. She has a Finnish detective, not a Belgian detective. She talks a lot about women's intuition, a bit like Miss Marple, actually. She instinctively, like her big solution to the murder of the 4 potential suspects is, oh, definitely Roberts. He has a Welsh name. Can't trust the Welsh.
Right.
She is clearly smart. She's capable. She's good fun to be around. She's no nonsense. She's successful, financially very successful, but not self-important. She's got a real lightness of touch. She's not pompous. And she is treated as an equal, both by Poirot and Battle, who have no hesitation into, bringing her into their circle, even though she's not detected in real life before. And I think that just really says something about her as a character and them as characters. And Agatha Christie really showing, you know, this meta character to be an equal at the table. So yeah, how did you find Ariadne Oliver?
I did enjoy her. I found it very touching when she has Rhoda over and gives her, Rhoda asks, if I buy one of your books, can I post it to you and will you sign it for me? And she said, oh no, I'll do you one better, and takes her to a cabinet, pick one. And I found that really endearing. I wonder if that opened up Christie to some, insane
Random
request.
random fangirls turning up at her block of flats thinking, oh,
Yeah.
do you think I'll get hot coffee and buttered
Yeah,
toast?
she might have felt about that. I really enjoyed it's third person, but sort of from her POV little inner monologue thing, getting out of the car. That cracked me up
Yeah.
because I drive what I call my little clown car. It's very compact and
Yeah.
I'm not quite middle-aged, but I'm certainly overweight. And I feel you, girl. Slamming your
Well,
knee into the
I am
getting.
exactly the age that Agatha Christie was when she wrote this book. I'm probably around the same size. And I can certainly tell you that when I try and get in my husband's like quite low to the ground sports car, I have to be like, oh, the knees. So I sympathize with it too. But it is such a, she's portraying a very powerful businesswoman and an incredibly successful popular author, and yet it's so charming and so disarming. I think it's lovely. When Rhoda Dawes meets her for the first time, she says, "You're so different from what I imagined. A disappointment, I expect," said Mrs. Oliver serenely. "I'm used to that." How heartbreakingly hilarious.
I like the bit where she's never done a real murder before. And you know what? I don't think it's my line. Oh, shit.
We get a lovely, lovely impression of her. So this is the impression of, Mrs. Oliver when Rhoda goes to her flat. So Rhoda perceived a battered kitchen table with a typewriter on it, masses of typescript littered all over the floor, and Mrs. Oliver, her hair in wild confusion, rising from a somewhat rickety-looking chair. "Oh, my dear, how nice to see you," Mrs. Oliver, holding out a carbon-stained hand and trying with her other to smooth her hair, a quite impossible proceeding. A paper bag touched by her elbow fell from the desk and apples rolled energetically all over the floor. And one of the things in this book is she's just had bangs cut, or a fringe cut, as we'd say in English, and she keeps forgetting, and she'll sort of ruffle her hair and her hair will vertically stick up at the front. I mean, it's so ramshackle and lovely. I feel she's definitely one of us.
She gets out of the car and a bunch of apple cores fall out. And then she's in the house and a bunch of apples go rolling about.
And actually, this is a trope we've seen before. Agatha Christie tried to give us a detective writer in Death in the Clouds, and he was addicted to bananas. So she was obviously trying out the idea of including a fake Agatha. And there's also another really lovely passage, which I'm going to pretty much just read out, which describes the writing. And because I think this must be very close to how Agatha Christie really felt. And I think for the listener, this will be quite fun. So Rhoda says, fangirling. This is such a standum kind of relationship. "Oh, Mrs. Oliver, it must be marvellous to write." Mrs. Oliver rubbed her forehead with a carbony finger and said, "Why?" "Oh," said Rhoda, a little taken aback, "because it must be wonderful just to sit down and write off a whole book." And shades of George R.R. Martin here for all of us George R.R. Martin fans. It doesn't happen exactly like that," said Mrs. Oliver. "One actually has to think, and thinking is always a bore, and you have to plan things, and then one gets stuck every now and then, and you feel like you'll never get out of the mess, but you do. Writing's not particularly enjoyable. It's hard work, like everything else." "Doesn't seem like work," said Rhoda. "Not to you," said Mrs. Oliver, "because you don't have to do it. It feels very like work to me. Some days I can only keep going by repeating over and over to myself the amount of money I might get for my next serial rights. That spurs you on. So does your bank book when you see how much overdrawn you are." "I never imagined you actually typed your books yourself," said Rhoda. "I thought you'd have a secretary." "I did have a secretary, and I used to try and dictate to her, but she was so competent that it used to depress me. I felt she knew so much more about English and grammar and full stops and semicolons than I did, that it gave me a kind of inferiority complex. Then I tried a thoroughly incompetent secretary, but of course that didn't answer very well either." "It must be so wonderful to be able to think of things," said Rhoda. Oh, I can always think of things, said Mrs. Oliver happily. What's so tiring is writing them down. I always think I've finished, and then when I count it up, I've only written 30,000 words instead of 60,000. And so then I have to throw in another murder and get the heroine kidnapped again. It's all very boring. So that was a long extract, but I think there's so much probably truth about lots of writers in there, that it is work, is hard, and I think it's kind of brave of Agatha Christie to say, sometimes I just do this because I want to get some money in. I like money. Money is important to me.
I'm glad you brought that passage up. I meant to also because, we've talked on this reread before about she must have just done this one for the paycheck, very phoned in, not all of them are great. And at a certain point, when you're churning out, what, a couple of dozen or more real bangers in your lifetime. Of course, there's going to be some duds in the mix and some ones that you just did for the money. And for her to own up to that in this way is, I think, also really special, where she's now at a status where she can say that publicly, sort of, vicariously through her character, and not be ashamed about it. It reminded me of, if you've ever seen the show Community, at the very end, the character Abed says, it's TV, it's okay for it to have a day off. It's okay for it to phone in something. It's a companion and it's art, and not all of it is brilliant, but it's there for you.
Yeah, exactly. And it's reliably there for you. It's a Christie for Christmas.
So genuine, and so we should be forgiving to some of the artists in our midst. They're not all going to be bangers. Like M. Night Shyamalan, for example. They're not all winners, but look at his body of work. Look at the things that he has given us that are so intriguing. Don't let the off days diminish the great days. Right?
Exactly. The book literally before this, Murder in Mesopotamia, is just terrible, and yet it's sandwiched by ABC Murders and this. So I think it is just a plea for kindness. And I do find it also quite touching that when she talks about the secretary who knew grammar better than she did. And you have to think, Agatha Christie never went to school. She was educated badly by governesses at home, and basically only got a smidgen of education because World War I happened and she went out to be a volunteer trainee nurse. And, I bet, to be one of the most famous, most successful, commercially, incredibly successful authors of your time, and never to have really been taught properly, I bet she did probably, have sort of insecurities and imposter syndrome about, she wasn't part of the Bloomsbury group and T.S. Eliot and all the highfalutin peeps out there in this period, but she was incredibly well liked. So good for Agatha Christie.
If Queen Elizabeth II had sort of known that about her and had maybe a care for that, because Queen Elizabeth II was also not, she wasn't educated to the position she ended up having in life. And
I think she was very sort of self-conscious about that and felt very, I think she's on the record as saying that she resented that she wasn't educated properly. And again, like Agatha Christie, it was educated by governesses at home. And she did have some constitutional history, so she was taught literally what it means to be the queen. But other than that, she always used to resent it. But what I find fascinating about Queen Elizabeth II, and also about Agatha Christie, is that as life, their kind of position allowed them to travel and see things in the world and talk to interesting people. And I think both of them were amazing autodidacts. And I often think by the end of her life, Queen Elizabeth II must have known more than most about human nature and about, she'd visited ridiculous numbers of countries. She'd met practically every world leader. She'd lived through political crises. So much knowledge had accrued to her. And Agatha Christie taught herself to be a detective novelist, taught herself basically to be on an archaeologist's dig, taught herself to manage business affairs. Both really impressive, right?
Yeah, definitely.
It's actually worth noting that, speaking of Queen Elizabeth II, 1936 was an absolutely kind of crazy year in Britain, because the King George V died in the year, and then his son Edward VIII ascended to the throne, but then also abdicated, resulting in Queen Elizabeth's father, King George VI, coming to the throne. So it was the year of three kings. So it was a very turbulent time for England, and so I suppose maybe something like this book would have given a lot of people in the country a lot of good escapism, right? Real real need for stuff like this. It's also the year in which Alan Turing submitted his paper on computable numbers to the London Mathematical Society, introducing the concept of the Turing machine. So there you go. How cool is that?
What a year.
Yeah, what a year. And obviously the rise of fascism in Europe. And
yeah, the 30s are such a weird time. Like, you've got a whole generation still recovering from one war. You're looking down the barrel at another big one. Fuck.
Crazy. It's actually, I hadn't realized it's
I mean, there must have been a lot of like depression and sensibility of like, well, what the hell's the point? You know, there must have been a lot of ennui.
Yeah. And fear, just straight up fear. I mean, most of these people had fought in World War One, had lost family members in World War One, and like thinking another world war's coming your way. It's also the year, I hadn't realized this, of the Battle of Cable Street, which is a street that I drive down quite a lot now, actually. It's in East London, kind of between the city and Canary Wharf now. And it's where Oswald Mosley, the little fuck, and his British Union of Fascists had a street march. And basically the people of East London, the ordinary working class people of East London came out, basically just beat the crap out of them, told them to fuck off. So, good. I mean, it would have been a motley crew of like trade unionists, communists, anarchists, British Jews.
Yeah, I was going to say
Irish emigre workers, socialist groups. It was a real kind of like Antifa of its time. And it was just like a real independent Labour Party. It was like a real union of people coming together, and actually the Metropolitan Police. So basically, yeah, to me, that was like, if Britain was ever going to turn to fascism, Oswald Mosley was going to try it, and he tried it, and London came together and just said, no, bugger off. We're not having any of that nonsense here. So
name gives me like the creeps when you say it.
Yeah, but there you go.
That makes my blood run cold. It's like right up there with like Himmler and Hitler to me. Ugh, gross.
But the numbers are amazing, actually. So there were 2,000 to 3,000 up to 5,000 fascists, which sounds like a lot because Cable Street ain't big. Then there's 6,000 to 7,000 policemen, which is quite a lot. And then the anti-fascist counter demonstrators range from 100,000 to 300,000.
God damn, good for them.
So 5,000 fascists versus 100,000 to 300,000 bloody angry Londoners. I mean, like...
Well, and you have to imagine those numbers are proportionate if you extrapolated them to the rest of the country, you know?
Yeah. I mean, that just makes me so proud of... I mean, not that, as I think we'll find out later in this episode, not that England was not a place with racism, anti-Semitism, misogyny. I'm not saying that by any means it was in some way like the superior sort of place to be. That kind of makes me proud.
Yeah, that percentage makes me feel good.
Well, hold on to that thought, because we're going to get into some of the shit stuff in this novel later. But anyway, interesting year for a novel that maybe, you know, was therefore reassuring to readers. I mean, nice to have a puzzle novel that is kind of bracketed in a kind of safe world, right? That there's evil in this world, but we can pick from these four people and we can solve it and we can triumph over it. I guess that must have felt like a pretty reassuring concept in the time of Hitler. Okay, so those are our detectives. Shall we get into Shaytana, the victim of this crime, the host of the dinner party?
Well, he's not there for a lot, but I think he's a lot like Mephistopheles. I think it's mentioned once or twice. Or 15 times.
Well, I mean, his name is loosely based on Satan, right? I mean, he used to love playing fancy dress as Mephistopheles. I mean, this is a guy who is obviously very rich, collects beautiful, ornate objects. I mean, he's a complete shit in some respects. I mean, like, he was playing a dangerous game. He used to like wheedling secrets out of people. And he had collected the four people together who are the suspects because he believed that they had all committed murder and gotten away with it. So he was like, I want to collect objets d'art, but I also want to collect successful murderers. And then he held that information over them. And you sort of feel like, what an idiot. Like, if you collect successful murderers who've gotten away with it and somehow tell them that you know that they're successful murderers, do you not think one of them's going to have a go at murdering you?
Right. Okay, so the Arabic word for God is Allah, and the Arabic, well, I don't know if it's Arabic or just Islamic word for the devil is Shaitan.
Yeah, same in some of the Indian languages that we speak as well. So yeah. So, but I think Yeah. I mean,
obviously to draw that connection well, and then the Faustian references, to him being the devil's aide, or, right hand man, sort of. I think he's maybe painted a little too heavily in that light, given the fact that he is an innocent. He's just an extravagant person with maybe a little too much hubris. Like, Poirot sums it up towards the end of the book of, he was a stupid man.
Yeah, exactly. So the quote is, he played the part of the devil too well, but he was not the devil. Au fond, he was a stupid man, and so he died. It is the sin that is never forgiven and always punished, which is kind of brutal but true. So
Yes.
Gillian Gill, the author I mentioned earlier, thinks it's deliberate that she paints him almost like a pantomime villain. And she says that she is subverting kind of racist expectations by making the quote-unquote suspicious foreigner actually the victim. So, quote, in Christie's worldview and the world of her fiction, evil is both very real and hard to spot. It does not advertise itself with elaborate dinner jackets, sinister mustachios, and wicked repartee. So I think her point is that this is this guy who is very clearly foreign, and a lot of people are kind of racist about because he is foreign, especially Major Despard. But actually, you might be lured, if you're a reader of the time who is a little bit racist, because I think pretty much everyone was, to think less of him and to think, oh, he is Satan and he's foreign and he's evil. But actually, he turns out to be the victim. So I don't know if the listener, and if you want to give Agatha Christie the benefit of the doubt that she's trying to make a point that we shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but that's Gillian Gill's theory anyways. Okay, so let's get into the 4 suspects who we know that Shaytana has collected together because he thinks they've gotten away with murder. So we kind of, as the reader, have to make a decision about, do we believe that they got away with murder? And then secondly, do we believe that they murdered Shaytana because he knew? So there's kind of 2 layers to it. The first one is Dr. Roberts, who is a very kind of fashionable, very well-paid private doctor, has lots of patients, seems very respectable. I suppose there could always be the suspicion with a doctor that he's murdered one of his patients deliberately, but just seems very regular, respectable. How do you, without giving away the ending, how do you find Dr. Roberts as a character?
Pretty standard Christie suspect. I found him very similar to the dentist guy in Death in the Clouds, for the first act of that book.
Yeah, very kind of anonymous professional.
In the mix, he's kind of young.
Yeah. And he's just kind of, I feel like he's not very charismatic compared to Major Despard. I mean, Major Despard, we're told, is an absolute dreamboat. He's really good looking. We know that he's a bit like Colonel Race and all those kind of characters, like from like the man in the brown suit and the early Christies, who's like irresistible adventurer, a bit like an Indiana Jones type. And he's like a real man's man in that kind of like very macho way that I think Agatha Christie really straightforwardly admired it in the 1920s. And by the 1930s, she was almost starting to find it a bit ridiculous. And you see that with how she treats Colonel Arbuthnot in Orient Express. She finds it a little bit old-fashioned and has less patience for it. But this is the quote that sums him up. Never take anything for granted, Miss Dawes. I don't set as much value on human life as most people do. All this hysterical fuss about road deaths, for instance. Man is always in danger, from traffic, from germs, from 101 things. As well be killed one way as another. The moment you begin being careful of yourself, adopting as your motto safety first, you might as well be dead, in my opinion. I mean, what a douche. But anyway, how did you find Major Despard, Hannah?
I didn't really. To me, he was so background. Not there for a lot of it.
He's meant to be our action hero. Yeah, but he's meant to be our big action hero. So that's kind of interesting. To me, that's a fail on Agatha Christie's part if you find him blending into the background.
I feel like I have more of an explanation of why, but I have to save it for the second half.
Okay, well, we'll save that for the spoiler section. Then we have Mrs. Lorimer, who's a bit like Dr. Roberts, just very respectable, upper middle class. She's a widow, rich widow, elegant, formidable. She's by far the best bridge player. She is very smart, like the way she describes the bridge game. Poirot seems to be really impressed with her. In a book where he's already impressed with Battle and Ariadne Oliver, he says, quote, she has probably the best brain of the 4. He really expresses genuine kind of astonishment and appreciation for her. Just a real class act, right? Even though she's a suspected murderer. So, Mrs. Lorimer, thoughts, feelings?
I have a lot to say on her for the second part, but for this first part, I will say that I actually enjoyed her character, not for the suspected murder part, but for her card playing. I really found a lot of myself in that description. So there's this very complicated card game that my family plays when we're all together, and it's called we call it nervous, but I guess the real name of it is nerd. Basically, it's a mixture between speed and solitaire. Every player
Oh,
plays with their own deck, and you play off the aces communally, and speed is a big factor. And I'm quite good at it through a lot of practice, but part of what makes me really good at it is I can keep track of my own cards and everyone else around me playing. I
oh my
keep
goodness,
track
you are
of their
Mrs. Lorimer.
yeah, I keep track of what they're turning up. So if they lay something down, I need to make a move. I'm right there, boom, with it. And they always are like, "How do you do that?" And it's just like I keep
There you
it's
go.
where I keep everything's moving and I keep it moving. And very rarely am I caught boxed out of a move like that because I'm watching their cards and I'm watching my cards.
Yeah. Well, there you go. You're definitely Mrs. Lorimer, but I can't wait to hear what you say in the spoiler section. And then our final suspected murderer and potential murderer of Shaytana is a younger girl who is not like Mrs. Lorimer and Dr. Roberts, a sort of well-to-do upper middle class person. She's someone who is probably a little bit poorer. She's younger, looks very nervous, quite meek and mild. And her name is Anne Meredith. And she has worked as a companion to an old lady, just like the heroine of Mystery of the Blue Train. And she's up at the dinner party too. And she has a housemate who's much richer than her called Rhoda Dawes, who you've heard me mention before, listener, who is, by contrast with Anne Meredith, very independent spirited. She's a bit like Anne Bedingfield in Man in the Brown Suit. She's a lot more in the sort of mode of some of those Agatha Christie young, bright young thing, independent young women. But they are quite a modern pair. You know, they share a house in a village. They're quite independent. So Anne Meredith is our last suspect. Any thoughts on Anne that you can share, spoiler free?
Yeah, she's pretty seemingly one dimensional, and perhaps because I just rewatched the miniseries, but a little Jane Eyre, quiet, knowing her place. I did find it very interesting with the bridge scores, how Purple picks up on the fact that she comes from poverty because she flips her card over and writes on the back.
Yeah, she uses both sides of the paper.
And it made me wonder if Christie herself had maybe once seen someone do that at a card game and asked why.
Or maybe did that herself. I mean, you have to remember that she grew up very wealthy, but when her father died and she was a teenager, they lost all the money. And she went from being very well to do to having to really work for a living. And maybe that was something she felt she had to do.
Yeah, maybe.
She often writes of people who've gone through, you know, periods of poverty, but then periods of wealth. There's a really interesting character in Lord Edgware Dies, who's an actress, and Poirot comments on the fact that, you know, when you look at the contents of the handbag, there's like some parts look really kind of well made, like it might be a very expensive handkerchief, but then it might be a cheap compact. And, you know, this idea that you can see the fluctuations in people's income through their habits and what they were, I think is really interesting. And probably sadly comes from her life as someone who's both incredibly, not super poor, but like definitely in reduced circumstances, and then was incredibly wealthy.
It seemed like one of those things where she writes it and it comes from a real life anecdote.
Absolutely.
And I appreciated it. It really stuck out to me because I do that too. You know, I'll write on both sides, and we'll make copies of, like, if we're playing Balderdash, we'll make little copies of the scorecards and things.
Yeah, no, I agree. So we've gone through all the characters in some detail, listener, because, you know, there are basically 9 or 10 and it's worth doing so. Before we get into adaptations and the spoilery bit, let's do the sad bit of every episode where we kind of talk a little bit about how the book has aged. And I think in some ways it hasn't aged at all. I mean, it's just still really fun to read, but obviously the bridge isn't as popular, so that's a clear way in which it's aged. But also there is regressive stuff in there that's a bit disturbing. And I think you as a listener and a reader can make a decision on whether Agatha Christie actually thinks this stuff, or whether she's making a comment on people who do, because obviously Mr. Shaytana, with his very theatrical and sort of Middle Eastern look, comes in for a lot of racism. And I think maybe you can go with Gillian Gill and say that Agatha Christie's telling us this is wrong, but it is in the book. So Major Despard says of Shaytana, why did you want to, someone says to him, why did you want to kick him, Major Despard? Because he's the sort of dago he needed kicking badly. And dago being a very pejorative word for South Europeans, particularly Spanish, and really unpleasant. Like no one would use that word today, I would hope, in England, but would have been common then. It's the first time we've seen it in Christie, actually. It's really shocking because it's used a couple of times. And it's used by Despard, who's meant to be kind of like our dashing hero, which again makes me think that Christie's starting to cool on that type of guy. But then Agatha Christie, even in the third person, says, quote, every healthy Englishman who saw Shaytana longed earnestly and fervently to kick him. They said with a singular lack of originality, there goes that damn dago Shaytana. And you just think, oh my God. Like, is that how she felt? Is that what she thinks of English people at the time? Is she making a point? It's just really uncomfortable to read. And then he also gets anti-Semitism to add to the mix. Mrs. Oliver says, perhaps Shaytana was a moneylender. He has a very oily look, so coded for Jewish. And it's proper anti-Semitism. So at some point, Major Despard recommends to Anne Meredith that she gets a lawyer, and Rhoda asks her how the meeting went, and she says, all right, darling, what was the solicitor like? Very dry and legal. And Anne Meredith's response is, quote, rather alert and Jewish. Like, why would you have to specify that your lawyer was Jewish? Weird. And then just to round out the lovely gorgeousness of the crappy racism, you get proper anti-Black racism. Despard says, I never forget a face, even a black one. I mean, God, like, and then when someone's talking about someone dying in South America, someone says, quote, I wonder what they did with all that lovely lot of clothes. They're blacks out there, so they couldn't wear them because a black person can't wear a white person's clothes. And then Colonel Race, as he kind of, justifies giving an opinion on the case before going off to Afghanistan, declares that Major Despard could not have committed murder because Despard's, quote, a white man. So a white man can't have committed a murder. And actually Poirot does take him to task on that. Says, what, you think white men have never committed murder? What are you talking about, mate? But I think there's a lot of really nasty stuff about Shaytana. A lot of it comes from Despard. And I really do feel Agatha Christie's a little bit changing her mind about these colonial types and realizing just how abhorrent they are. Maybe because by this point she has traveled more in the Middle East and has seen more different people and has seen how they're treated. But, it does creep in even into the third person. So maybe it is partly how she felt. I don't know, but it makes me upset. So there we go. Any thoughts on that?
Pretty gross.
Pretty gross. There are adaptations to move the subject to something less disturbing. There's one of the David Suchet Hercule Poirots from the British channel ITV, which I think is actually very well done and very well cast. And it's really, it's very faithful and perfectly good to watch. I'm taking it that you listen to the audiobook. Hannah, would you recommend that? Is it good?
Yeah, very good. It's funny because if you're used to listening to him in stories that have Inspector Japp, his battle voice is very similar to Japp, so it can be a little bit at me at times like, oh, where'd Japp come in? But then you remember, oh no, he's not in this. It's the whole thing. It's not a radio play with this one, so it's the full book with all the narration.
Oh, okay, cool. Well, there you go, listen. You've got two good options. Very faithful TV adaptation, and you've also got a full audiobook. It's a really cracking book. If you haven't read it, it's not as famous as like ABC Murders, but I think it really is a great read. And if you like a real sort of closed room, locked house mystery, then this is for sure one for you. And Agatha Christie plays very fair. It's a tricky ending, but it's not like a playing with the genre. Like, it plays fair with the reader. The cards are on the table, so it genuinely is a fun one to try and puzzle out. But anyway, we hope you've really enjoyed this episode. We're going to come back after the break with some solution-y discussions. Can't wait to see how Hannah feels about what really happened. If you haven't read this, then please don't listen to that. Please go read it and then tune in for that. But the next novel we'll be doing is Dumb Witness, which was published in 1937. I'm going to do that as a mini pod because it's definitely very minor Poirot. And then the big one for 1937, which hopefully we'll get the Three Musketeers of me, Hannah and Xander back for, is Death on the Nile, which is fantastic. So, and has some very big screen adaptations. So if you are following along at home and want to read along with us, Death on the Nile is definitely worth your while. Right then, Hannah, let's get into the solution. So the listener, we know you know this because we know you're not naughty enough to listen without knowing the solution, is that Major Despard actually isn't really a murderer. He killed a man in South America. He was actually aiming to shoot him in the leg. He was delirious with fever, but the wife kind of jolted the gun and it shot him in the back. So he's not really a murderer, and he didn't do this. Mrs. Lorimer is a murderer. She murdered her husband, but in an act of complete class, never tells Poirot why. At one point, she confesses to the murder, however, because she's dying, has only a few months to live, and thinks it will give Anne Meredith the chance to live her life free of suspicion, which is quite a noble thing. Anne Meredith is also a murderer. She's also a petty thief. She had murdered one of her lady companions who realized she was a thief. And then when she realizes that Rhoda Dawes knows and is the only person who knows, she conspires to kill her too. But luckily, Major Despard saves the day. But finally, the person who really, really did it is Dr. Roberts, who has been killing patients and takes the chance, right? And the mechanism by which he takes the chance is that he bids 7 diamonds and is then doubled. So it's a very absorbing hand. It's a grand slam hand. And because the other players are very absorbed in the game, it leaves him free to go and make a drink, pick up the stiletto knife that's the objet d'art, the curio that Shaytana has, and stab him with it. He takes a chance because obviously Shaytana could have cried out in pain, but doesn't. And he thinks that because everyone's so absorbed in the game, they won't notice him, and they do not. So it's the respectable, upper middle class, more English than English doctor who killed the mysterious, nasty, Mephistophelian foreigner. So one could argue that with that solution, Agatha Christie is telling us everything we need to know about trusting appearances and being racist and making assumptions about nasty foreigners, because it's the more English than English doctor who done it. Right. Hannah, go. What did you think of all of this? What did you think of Mrs. Lorimer? What did you think of this solution?
Okay, so first of all, right away, after, so just as all the inquests begin, I'm pretty sure I had written this down either halfway through them questioning Mrs. Lorimer, which is chapter 5, or before that during chapter 4. I wrote down who I thought from 1 to 4. I ranked them of my suspects. So I ranked Anne Meredith as my number 1 suspect. I had Major Despard as my number 2. I had Lorimer as 3 and the doctor as 4.
Oh no!
Simply because of the too obviousness of it, and Ariadne Oliver saying he did it, he definitely did it, kind of thing. However, I could have easily rotated those clockwise as well. But Anne Meredith was definitely my number 1 from the get-go. I really thought it was her. I knew she was a bad egg from the start. So I had a couple of theories going when things kick off and they're, out of the room, out of the Shaytana's house, evolved into some pretty extraordinary theories. So around chapter 24, my big hypothesis that I wrote down is, and this is something I was on to pretty right away, Meredith is Shaytana's cook and a thief. She murdered him to shut him up. And my theory was, this was my working theory, because when they first get to the dinner party, Poirot has an aside with Anne Meredith about, well, his cook is so wonderful. And so I'm thinking how it would come out is that Poirot knew that Anne Meredith was employed as his cook. And then I felt very sure of myself later when her and Rhoda are like, we make the best coffee.
Yeah, that was so cool.
Because you never see the cook, And so I thought it was going to be one of those, very much like Clue, where, they're all invited there because everyone in the house is a suspect. And I was thinking that she actually poisoned his food and how it would go down is that all of them, like in Murder on the Orient Express, they all actually tried to kill him.
Because they all have a motive.
Because they all have a motive. So Anne Meredith really killed him because she poisoned him. And the reason he didn't cry out when he was stabbed is because he was already dead. That was my big working theory. But I had a bunch of other ones of, and
My
they all
theory
know.
is, I think she would have done. Like when she goes up and realizes he's dead, which is when Mrs. Lorimer thinks she's done it. I think she would have had a go at doing it and didn't have to because he was already dead. So I think of the four, I don't think Mrs. Lorimer would have done it, and Major Despard didn't need to do it and wouldn't have done it. But I think actually Anne Meredith could have done it if Dr. Roberts hadn't already done it.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously to me, it's like, well, she let him die, 'cause I have a feeling it's implied that by the time she gets there, he's not actually dead. So she doesn't say anything and lets him die. I don't think it was because she was afraid, or trying to cover anything up anymore. I think she's like, oh, okay, cool, job done. Thanks.
Happy days. It's kind of weird though, because even though like Dr. Roberts is horrible, I actually don't like Anne Meredith more. Like I think she's actually a pretty nasty person. Because I just sort of feel like such a petty reason, like nicking stockings and nicking stuff, and then you kill people to cover it up. And basically she tries to kill Rhoda, yes, because she thinks Rhoda knows, but also because she's just jealous that Major Despard likes her more. I mean, it's so nasty and selfish.
Yeah, she's and it's like Poirot says, she's the most dangerous one because, he makes mention of once you've decided who gets to live and who gets to die, there's a lot of danger and power there. You'll be empowered to do it again. But also, truly, like, she has a taste for it now, and everyone around her is disposable, and so she's an extremely dangerous psychopathic person. I had some theories going. She mentions that she's a member of a ladies' naval and military club, so I was thinking there was a connection between her and Major Despard for a while. Like 4 times over, Roberts mentions his nervous patient, and she displays signs of nervousness. So is she a patient of his? And then the one thing I was very disappointed in, I thought for sure that Mrs. Laura was going to turn out to be Mrs. Craddock, that she helped Roberts murder her husband and then fucked off to Egypt under her like maiden name or pseudonym of Lorimer, but that her true identity is the Mrs. Craddock and she's not actually dead. And Shaytana finds that out, and that would be her motive for the murder. And I was a little bit disappointed that in fact was not the case.
Wow, that would have been so cool though.
Up like Egypt, dead has poison husband. You know what I mean? Like
yeah, makes sense.
It makes me wonder if maybe Agatha was doing that and then like got it in her head that it was no good, or someone advised her to steer clear of that. Like if it was too much, if maybe like Ariadne Oliver says you got to winnow down. Maybe that's one of the links she winnowed down in the end, because it just, to me, it all lined up too well. And then they admit to knowing each other, so that part I was a little bit
really fascinating. I mean, I think that, I don't know, I like Mrs. Lorimer because in a sense she's a very sort of pure character. I mean, she doesn't reveal to Poirot why she killed her husband. She doesn't justify it. She doesn't apologize for it. She's willing to take the consequences. She tries to do one good act for Anne Meredith, who she thinks has killed Shaytana. I mean, I think it's very rare to hear Hercule Poirot really praise people, and he really evidently finds her absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, her stoicism in the way the writing came through to me reminded me a lot of the Russian, is she a princess, a duchess character from Orient Express?
Oh, yes. I know who you mean. Princess Dragomirov.
Yes, she reminds me a lot of her, just the cadence and the brightness, and the fact, the lack of apology, just the matter of factness of, yes, this is what I've done, and cards on the table, that's what it is. Like, I'm not going to try to make excuses, apologize, or anything else about it. It just is what it is. And I appreciate that Poirot like recognizes it and sort of admires it in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Were you satisfied by the answer, by the solution? Because Murder in Mesopotamia has such a stupid solution. Like, it just ruins the book for me. But was this one that, I mean, it's tricky because at first you think it's Mrs. Lorimer confesses, but Poirot can't cope with that. And then we think it might be Anne Meredith because we see her trying to murder Rhoda, but actually it's Dr. Roberts. How did you find the kind of the 3-layer solution?
Well, I did have a bit of a so Ariadne Oliver is so funny because right away she's like, Roberts did it. He's Welsh. He's a bad name. They're always, shady. The Welsh. That's it. I know the solution. Then, after speaking to, I believe it's Major Despa, or maybe it is Anne Meredith herself. She switches to Anne Meredith. She did it. I know for a fact she did it. And then, then by the end, she's like, I always said Dr. Roberts did it. And so when Lorimer confesses, I almost said, I kind of had a similar moment of like, oh, see, I knew it because I was going to rotate her to 1 at a certain point in my ranking. But then I didn't. I left it. So I sort of had the same thing. But then very quickly I realized, no, this can't be right because I actually looked at the chapter listing. So that tableau occurs in like chapter 26, and there was 31 chapters in the book. So I knew fairly right away something was not right with that it couldn't just be that. And obviously that turned out to be the case where she's lying. I do love how vehement Poirot becomes about, well, you must be lying to me. Tell me the truth now. And he almost becomes like violent about it and is so tormented by her confession not making sense, and the reason being she could not have possibly committed anything but a very premeditated murder. I thought was very interesting. And Poirot is always right, but the sort of the stubbornness there, it's like a Jekyll and Hyde thing with Poirot. He's been very mild version of him throughout the book, and then he just sort of unloads on her out of dissatisfaction for that solution.
Yeah.
But yeah, I did enjoy Lorimer in the end, probably as much as Poirot did. Really fascinating character.
I think it's a great book. I mean, I think it's just so fascinating to see Poirot in a different light, interacting with different people than we've seen him come to interact with. So Battle and Oliver. I think the suspects are kind of interesting in different ways. And I really love the ending. I really love the layered ending. I think this is just a genuine, like, you can say some of her books are overhyped or correctly judged, like Murder in Mesopotamia is correctly judged to be rubbish. But I think this is genuinely undervalued. I've said that of some of her earlier 1920s novels that I think have something to say for themselves. But I think this is legitimately a really good detective novel, and people should really, really go read it.
Very dynamic, and the characters are dynamic. But it's not hard to follow. It's just,
even with all the bridge talk
to it that keep you guessing. And like I said, I mean, I really tried hard to stick with it and pick up on every little clue, and I got close. Where by then I was very sure it was Anne Meredith, but I also had this reservation for Dr. Roberts because it's very much like Hastings picking up on the letters in ABC, right? Why was that delayed letter? So there's one line towards the beginning of the book where somebody says, well, it must have been Dr. Roberts because he would have known where to place the knife.
Yes, exactly.
And that's really true to me, especially given the fact that it's silent. And so I did always have that chestnut at the back of everything.
Immediate death through the heart, silence.
Yeah. So I knew something was going on with Dr. Roberts, especially like the way he questions his secretary after battle questions is a little too like nonchalant. Like, what did he ask you, by the way, kind of thing. So I knew he was hiding something. Again, I truly thought it would come down to all 4 of them, or at least 3 of them had their hand in it. Like I kept waiting for the autopsy report to be a factor of.
Yeah, but she kept saying she actually does write a prologue to this book, which she never does, a proper introduction. She says, I'm going to play fair with you. It isn't going to be, everyone did it or no one did it. Like, this is just going to be, there is one person who did it, and I'm gonna play totally fair with you.
Have that in the audiobook, so
sucks.
Might have helped me had I known that.
All the bridge scores.
Decided for this new one, I'm gonna get a hard copy and do it that way.
No. Next time there's a map or something, because I know you do the plays and the audios, I'll take a picture and send it to you, so I make sure you see it. So that can run that. Go forward. Is Death on the Nile one of the ones you like, or are you excited
I like it,
or is it like a medium one for you?
I like it. It's probably not like in my top 10. I don't hate it though, it's enjoyable. And the radio play of that one is probably one of the best of the radio play.
I've actually got that. I've got it in every format. I've got every film. It's one of my absolute favorites. Not because it's one of the best detective stories, but I just love the kind of the central, passionate, sort of obsessive love at it and the sort of the setting. So to me, I love it more as a book than as a detective book. Whereas this, I love more as a detective book. I think it's so good as a murder story.
Definitely a lot of the classics, right? It has the danger, the mystery, the romance, the fantastic of ancient civilization and stuff. So it's a very romantic book, I would say. And for the radio play, the quality of it enhances it so much with the sound effects and the music and things. I love it. It's one of my favorites.
I would definitely say that if you can get hold of the Peter Ustinov movie of it, it's definitely worth watching. And it's got David Evans as Race in it, or Hastings. I think it's kind of recast. It's Peter Ustinov is just so fantastic, and the cast is ridiculous. I mean, it's got flipping Mia Farrow in it. It's got it's just a ludicrous cast. Betty Davis is in it. I mean,
wow.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll save it for our Death on the Nile. But listener, if you've made it this far, thank you for joining us on this journey through Cards on the Table. Tremendous book. It gets us to the end of 1936, one of Christie's most prolific years. And we hope to see you, hear you, talk to you next time. In the meantime, if you want to chat about Agatha Christie or anything else pop culture, come find us on the Discord server. Find us, Google Vassals of Kingsgrave or VOK podcast, and you'll get to us. Alrighty, Hannah. Thank you so much. Thank you.